Hi, welcome to the Decoder Dialogue. I'm Marcy Burstener. I'm the Educational News Director at News Decoder. We're celebrating our 10th birthday this year, which is pretty exciting. Helping me in the background is Maria Krasinski, our Managing Director. For the past 10 years, we've worked with young people around the globe to help them appreciate diverse perspectives, think critically about global issues, and identify solutions to local and global problems. One way we do this is by bringing together students of different schools in different countries with experts to talk about controversial and important topics. This month's Decoder Dialogue is on defending democracy, and we're asking this question: does journalism matter? We have 5 panelists today. From Hungary, we have Helen Womack. She's a News Decoder correspondent. Helen has reported for Moscow for the Reuters International News Service, where she started. And since 2015, she's written for the United Nations Refugee Agency, and she's written for a number of publications. From Romania, we have Alexandru Ciocan. Alexandru is the editor-in-chief of Revistă. It's a youth-led, youth-focused online magazine run by an editorial team of young people. From France, we have 2 students with school year abroad, Breck DePaul and Sophie Kapishka. And I hope I got your name right. And finally, from India, we have Arya Sharma with the Vigbior High School. Before we begin, we've got some housekeeping. We encourage you in the audience to ask questions. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll find time to get to it. We're recording this Decoder Dialogue. And finally, we have a quick poll we want to begin with. We want to know what you think. Is journalism still essential to democracy? Do we have that poll? We'll give you a few minutes to think about this and to get your quick take. Okay, do we have results? Everyone thinks, whoa, this might be a self-selected audience, I think. Um, we'll have to see after people have watched the recorded, we'll have to do another poll. I'm very skeptical of unanimous opinions. We're going to get right into this. So Breck and Sophie, we're going to start with you. And Breck, you can start. But what differences have you noticed in news consumption and production in France compared to back home?
Well, I think consumption, especially among the youth, and I'm talking middle school, high school age students, is actually less in France than it is in the US. If we sort of picture like a horse race, I think US teenagers start out of the gate a little earlier, but they're going much slower. But then I've noticed that as and I hate to make generalizations, but as French kids age into universities, there's this huge spike in news consumption and political awareness. Um, at the university level. And so I think actually once we look at university aged French people, we see a higher level of news consumption and more political awareness and education than we do in the US.
Is that what you found, Sophie?
Similar to Breck, I've definitely noticed a large difference between like children my age in the US and in France. So first of all, I come from Washington, D.C., which of course is a very politicized place. So I've always for my entire life been surrounded by the news and politics. And I've always been like all my friends, we always talk about the news because it's just, a part of our lives. Meanwhile, in France, I've noticed a bit of a difference. For example, one day with our school, we went to a local French high school and we in my political science class and we discussed politics, and I found that a lot of the French students were not as seemingly interested or specifically like they didn't really just know much about French politics but also international politics like the US elections and stuff. So that was a big thing I noticed. And also, I mean, of course, I think the French have, this idea, at least for me, I've always seen France as a very, politicized place as well, with lots of protests and manifestations. And of course, we still see that. But I think around the youth that are like my age in high school, there is a pretty large difference. And I think the French kids seem to be less involved.
Okay. And Arya, now you come from the world's largest democracy. Um, are there, how do people consume news there? Are there lots of news outlets? Do you tend to find, as we do in the US, actually, I live in Ireland, but from the US, that there's just like one newspaper per town?
So India has one of the most diverse and expansive media landscapes because people come from different culture backgrounds and speak different languages. So there are over 100,000 registered newspapers and hundreds of news channels, and the news is broadcasted in in more than 20 languages. So India has both state-run and private um, run media networks, and nowadays, digital journalism has seen a rapid growth with platforms like The Wire and The Print. And where I'm from originally, in Pune, Maharashtra, Pune is one of the major metropolitan cities, and it has newspapers in English, Marathi, and Hindi. Marathi, that's the local language. And yeah, I feel India has one of the most has diverse um, ways to provide media to the public.
Well, that's great.
And yeah.
That's great to hear. Now I want to talk a little bit about the other thing we're connecting here in this Decoder Dialogue, or we're trying to connect, is the idea of democracy. So I'm going to go to you, Helen, because you're living in Hungary and you've been a reporter in Moscow and you're quite knowledgeable about other types of government structures. And so the question we want to ask you is, why is democracy better than dictatorship? Is it?
Well, I mean, this really ought to be a no-brainer, but since now about a fifth of young people in the UK are questioning this and suggesting that maybe having a strong leader is better, well, I think we'd better try and answer this question. Voters may prefer a strong man, they may prefer dictatorship because they think that will give them stability, predictability, that it will relieve them of the burden of having to make decisions themselves and take responsibility. You know, Big Daddy will do it for them. They may think dictatorship will give them efficiency, trains that run on time, and, you know, flashy new infrastructure. So why then, nevertheless, is democracy better? And the answer, I think, in my view, it's not a moral argument. It's not that, you know, democracy is fairer, that it allows for a range of opinions, although of course it does. But it's a purely pragmatic reason why democracy is preferable. And it's this, that in our life, change is inevitable. We cannot stop change. It's happening all the time. And democracy factors in the problem of change. It allows us to have periodic elections every 4 years, every 5 years. If we don't like the politicians we've got now, in 5 years' time, we can change them. And therefore, democracy allows for a peaceful transfer of power. And even in America, when Trump came to power, we in fact saw a very peaceful transfer from Biden to Trump. Whereas what dictatorship does, it denies change. Lukashenko's been in power in Belarus for 30 years. Putin's been in power in Russia for over 20 years. Museveni in Uganda has been in power for over 20 years. There are young people today in Russia, for example, who have never known anything but the rule of Putin. Well, the problem is that sooner or later, change will come. It definitely will come. And when you've got a dictator trying to keep the lid on everything, when that change does come, it's bloody. And my colleague Alexandru in Romania will, of course, remember the case of Ceausescu, the dictator who seemed immovable, irremovable. It was Ceausescu for year after year after year, and we never thought we would see anybody in Romania other than Ceausescu until on Christmas Day 1989, Ceausescu and his lovely wife Elena were put up against a wall and shot. And so that is why, in my opinion, democracy is better than dictatorship.
Okay. We're gonna I'm getting a little bit of feedback. We're gonna get to you, Alexandru, in a moment. But Sophie, you had a question for Helen. Did you not? Oh, no, I'm sorry. We have a question in the audience, from the audience. Helen, our audience wants to know, as someone who has reported on Russia for a long time, are dictatorships really more efficient in some ways, or is it just an assumption? Do trains run on time in Russia?
Yes, they do, but I'm not sure that's got anything to do with Putin. I think that's got to do with the hard work of the Russian railways. The railways, that the trains certainly did run on time in Germany under Hitler, and now the German trains don't run quite so well. So there may be some correlation. But yes, I think that the efficiency of dictatorships is also to some extent a myth.
Often dictatorships come with corruption, don't they?
Yes, exactly. And that's why the dictators don't want to give up power. They want to keep on to power because they want to keep their ill-gotten gains.
Okay. Alexandru, we're going to get to you now. You work as a journalist and an educator. I'm wondering, how exactly does journalism support democracy? Can you connect the two of them for us?
Again, as Helen said, this should be also a no-brainer. Of course, journalism supports democracy, but it depends on the type of journalism. And here I think we are touching a very sensitive topic, especially for young people, because they have a great mistrust in traditional media. They believe traditional media is doing someone's game or is simply unreliable. And that's why they are seeking alternative ways of informing and forming their opinions. But a healthy press, a good mainstream press, definitely it's one of the pillars of also healthy democracy, because it gives people the hard, naked truth. In order to be able to make informed decisions, whether good or bad, it doesn't matter, you have to be correctly informed. And you have to have a multitude of perspectives and of opinions. And again, a good, healthy press does that. You cannot maintain the core of democracy, which is a healthy debate and a healthy disagreement, without having all the facts. And that means you have to be well informed by, again, a well-established traditional press. In the later times, we've seen a lot of various actors. I'm referring now to influencers, for example, that took on the role of journalists. And a lot of young people tend to mix the two, the real journalists, let's say, and influencers with various opinions. And it's important to be able to make this difference, to tell them apart. Again, in order to make good decisions, you have to have good intel, let's say. Let's use this, this term from espionage. And that's impossible without a strong press. Even, I would say, even bad press helps, because it contributes to the constant push and pull that is necessary in a democracy. Dictatorship doesn't have this problem, because all the newspapers are basically the same. They're all saying the same things. They just regurgitate what they receive from the government. So actually, even less than ideal press, I think, helps, because it keeps the discussion alive and the disagreements alive. As long as we can politely disagree, we are fine, or we are on a safer road.
It's really interesting because from what you said, I heard two things that seem to be caveats. And one is the idea of media as a trusted source, and two, media as a way to bring diverse opinions into the conversation. So I'm going to go to you, Breck, and I'm going to ask you this question. Do you trust the news media? And do you think that the people around you trust the news media?
I mean, I think the question of sort of growing distrust of the media in youth um, is a multifaceted question. I think media is anything and everything we consume, whether it's online or in the paper. And so I think what we're really referring to is like mainstream media. In the US, we think of CNN, Fox News, right? The two big, left-leaning, right-leaning news sources. But I think really why we're seeing this distrust and this sort of hopeless attitude towards mainstream media among the youth is because it's losing its politeness. It's not the productive discourse, and it's not journalism that's informing productive discourse because it's creating anger and disagreement that doesn't lead to change and doesn't create change for the future because people can't cross those differences. It's inciting conversations that aren't necessarily productive. And so I think that's why we're seeing a distrust and young people turn away from mainstream media is because it's not useful anymore. It's not productive.
Helen, you had something to say on this?
Well, I wonder whether, in fact, it is the mainstream media, Breck, that's inciting people, or rather the social media. But just picking up on what Alexandru was saying about information is power, and how our citizens need information to make decisions about their lives. I just wanted to tell you one funny story about when I was interviewing some old KGB agents for a book in Moscow. And one of the KGB agents, he was a man called Oleg Brikin. He'd worked undercover at the United Nations as a translator. But really what he was doing was sending home information for the KGB. So I said to him, oh, so what kind of stories and information were you sending back then to Moscow? And he said, well, what I used to do, I would go out to the news kiosk and I'd buy Time magazine and I'd buy Newsweek. And then I'd just summarize what was in these two news magazines and I'd send it to Moscow. And I said, was that it? Were those all your secrets? And he said, yes, that was it. But the point was that the contents of Time and Newsweek were only available to the Politburo. They were not available to the mass of ordinary people. And so information is power. Only 12 people in Moscow knew what was in Time and Newsweek.
Wow. So the second part, the second caveat that I heard from you, Alexandru, was trust in government. Oh no, I'm sorry. It was about that the media brings diverse opinions to the conversation. And so I'm going to ask you, Sophie, do you think the news media brings diverse opinions to the conversation?
I mean, I think yes, depending on obviously what type of source you're getting your information from. For example, I mean, lots of like Breck was saying, CNN, Fox, the different things that we have in the US. But also, I mean, lots of my friends, for example, use social media as a method of getting information. So like TikTok, Instagram, these sites that, give you little highlights of the news. Like it doesn't really give you the full story, but just like, maybe one idea. So I think having this diversity of different types of news just opens your like perspective into understanding the larger story, which is behind all these different things that we're learning about in the news. So yes, I think it is a pretty straightforward. Like I think it gives you so many different ideas and options when you have a larger perspective and you are actually searching for more information. I think that's very important.
But isn't that the case that you have to be searching for that information?
I mean,
to have access to it. So then I'm going to go to Arya, because Arya, you told us that there's so many different sources of news
Yes.
in India. But India is a country with many different, very distinct communities. And so with all these diverse news sources, do you see them bridging these divides, or is India very similar to what's happening in the US and in Britain and in many places where there just seems to be these divisions that people cannot talk across?
So I believe these divisions are based on personal beliefs. Like if you yourself believe that these divisions cannot be bridged, then that's how it works. But yes, communities are working to bridge the gap and ensure that as we, function as one, rather than someone that's divided by religion and beliefs. And I feel that India, the reason there's so many diverse ways to give the public a way to access information is so that no matter what language you speak, you have a way to access the news. And I feel that is one of the ways we can actually ensure that we function as one.
Great. We have yes.
I see this question lingering in the Q&A, and it's that young people distrust traditional news outlets. Do you distrust them? Do your friends distrust them? I wonder whether this distrust is an assumption that we make or whether it's really there. And to respond to it, I don't know if distrust is the right word, but I think as news and media has digitalized and moved to TikTok, Instagram, as you're scrolling through your phone on your news app, it's trying to grab your attention with headlines. And so you'll read something and maybe a little light bulb goes off in your head like, what, like this sounds absurd, or that can't be true, or there's no way this is actually the right story. There has to be something missing here. And so there's almost this game you play with headlines, these games you play with little sound bites and pieces of information that I think breeds a distrust because people are trying to grab your attention in the news. I mean, primarily in the US, we don't have any state-run news publications. We don't have government-run news channels, radios, etc. And so most all news outlets are for profit. They are trying to get you to read their stories. And I think that inherently creates or gives them a profit incentive to grab your attention and maybe bend what we see as the truth. So yes, I think there's distrust. I don't know if it's I don't believe everything I read from this news source or this news source. I think it's very dependent on where it's coming from, what the story is, what the topic is, my personal background, belief, previous information. But yes, I think there is some distrust. I think it's just nuanced.
Well, that kind of connects to another question that the audience is asking. I'm going to throw this to you, Alexandru. Media can be bribed. This is the question from the audience. Okay, this isn't from me. I cannot be bribed, by the way. Media can be bribed. How are we sure that what we are hearing we can trust?
Well, one thing that we can do is to verify from multiple sources, which is the foundation of journalism. Basically, what we lost in recent decades, it's the ability and the intention to verify information. Because I'm trying to connect to something that's already being said. We know about some papers, some media outlets that are left-leaning or right-leaning, but that is important. If you want to, for example, to form an opinion about something, you can read the same news reported by the left-leaning and the right-leaning newspapers, and you can make an intersection. You can search for the third, fourth, fifth source. I don't know. And it is important even to have those clearly labeled outlets, I think. Yes, media can be bribed, and we have numerous examples of it being so. But again, this is an information that we already have. At least in Romania, if you just come here now and get off from the airport in Bucharest, the first person you meet can give you a list of trustworthy or untrustworthy news outlets, and they can easily tell which one is leaning right and which one is leaning left, for example, because they positioned themselves very clearly. But in a way, this is fair. You know what you're getting. Okay, so those journalists, let's say, are paid by somebody, but you already know that. Very few people still believe in truly independent media. In Romania, for example, there are very few outlets which have documented funding sources and mainly fund themselves through donations, for example. But we know which ones are in this category. So even with this suspicion, I think we can, I don't know, we can tell apart good from bad. It's not a hopeless situation by any means. And this is not a new situation. This is not a disease that the media has in the last 2 or 3 decades. We had paid journalists and I don't know, less trusted journalism for, I don't know, at least 100 years.
Oh yeah, in the U.S., I mean, the American Revolution was basically founded on misinformation from the press. So there's a long history of it, but we do tend to think that everything began with the internet. We have a question for Arya, and this kind of connects to what Breck was saying about how in the United States there is no state-run media. And so the question to you, Arya, from the audience is, in India, do you know who owns the news outlets? Are, you know, are they state-run, or is it clear who the owners are?
So in India, most news outlets are run by private companies rather than the state. So, but however, there are some state-controlled news outlets like Doordarshan, that's one of them. So I believe India has like a balance of private-owned and government information. So, yes.
Okay. And there was another question here that I was going to throw to you, Helen, and that's in the US we don't have state-run news, but the audience wants to know, but we have politicians telling us not to trust mainstream news. Does that contribute to young people's mistrust? So I guess the question is, can you have a trusted news source if the politicians are not buying into that idea?
Well, I mean, I think a degree of distrust is actually not an unhealthy thing. You know, it's skepticism, isn't it? So, I mean, you might have a fairly strong degree of trust in an organisation like the BBC, and yet you would nevertheless, you know, switch channels to ITN to compare. And I think that's an absolutely healthy thing to do. But the way that politicians are now cynically undermining the media is a really dangerous thing, and the cynicism of modern dictators is terrifying.
Sophie, you brought up the idea of news influencers and social influencers and people getting their information from other sources like TikTok. Is this do you think this is a good thing? Is this healthy that people are turning to sources that aren't traditional news media for information?
I mean, I think it's like a dual-ended sword. That, like, on one hand, it can be a good thing, of course, to have, you know, a diverse variety of sources, you know, just like having one thing that's like great about TikTok and things like Instagram is it really gives you like the highlights, kind of, you know, you see a video, you see a photo, and that, like Breck said, automatically catches your attention. And, you know, maybe you want to read more about it, so you go to a different news source, like something trusted, like Guardian, whatever, New York Times. But I think, again, it can really come with this idea of having to be careful with the sources that you choose and how you just see the news in general. So, for example, say I see something on TikTok, that doesn't mean, first of all, that I'll automatically believe it, because I think, unfortunately, the media today has become very tricky. So you really have to be careful. But I think, yes, it can be a great thing, just, having a different type of source, which has been very recent. TikTok has been like a really like brand new thing, and that's a whole different conversation. But I think it just really depends, and that most people should be very careful with how you decide to gather your news sources. So, yeah.
Here's a question then for the three of you, the three students, from the audience. Do you subscribe and pay for any news sources? So let's start with you, Breck.
Yes, I do. So I love, of course, I follow New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal just to get sort of my daily news on the highlights through Instagram. And then I also subscribe to The Atlantic and then Washington Post, New York Times again, so I can read full articles. And I do I see I mean, of course, these corporations have to make money in order to stay alive, but I feel honestly it's quite difficult to stay informed without getting through that paywall, um, and getting to
Mhm.
mainstream journalism. It's difficult.
Is that the same that you found, Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, same thing for me. Personally, I love to read the news, every morning on my commute to school. So I love The Guardian because it's free, like normally. So I have the app on my phone, and I really just read it because I love the sense of variety on international issues. And one thing is, I would love to have a subscription to the New York Times, but of course the paywall is there. So I'm not subscribed to that, but my family obviously has many different sources. So sometimes I read Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times occasionally, but yeah, I daily read the news, and I also go on CNN to see highlights, videos, different sources. So yeah,
Do you think you're unusual?
I would say yes. I mean, not to make myself sound like putting myself like up there, but I think a lot of people really don't invest time, especially at my age, into reading the news and really being, well educated and well versed into different issues. And I think that's something that most people should, try to see. I don't know. I think it's a great thing to be well versed in different things. So yeah, I don't know.
So Arya, is a paywall a problem for you? Do you subscribe to any news outlets?
Yes, so my family, we've subscribed to The Hindu, and it comes every day. And I say the paywall is a problem because I believe that news should be available to everyone. So instead of opting for newspapers, people usually go for channels online that you can get through YouTube, like ABP News. And even if I don't read the news, my dad blasts in the morning, so I get my daily quota.
Yes. And just to sort of bounce off of Sophie, I think most teenagers and high schoolers don't daily read and listen to the
Yeah.
news, and I think we are in the abnormality because first off, it's very depressing, especially to scroll in the morning and read just about horrific things happening around the world or, a very depressing outlook on the future of our country. It's not exactly a great way to start a morning when you're already upset that you're getting up at 6:30 in the morning and having to go to school or go to work. Um, but I think it's just young people feel very disconnected from the news. I have a friend here who tells me all the time, I don't read the news, I don't follow politics because what can I do about it? I can't vote, so when I can vote, sure, then I'll read the news. But I can't do anything, so why would I use my energy and use my time worrying about something that I can't change? Um, and when he told me that, I didn't know what to say because to a degree, he is right. Like, um, why would he spend his time worrying about something that he can't directly change with a vote? Like, sure, I guess that's true, but also these are things that's happening around him, and it's important to be educated in politics and in global affairs and how your community is being affected. And so I think it's a very difficult question and it doesn't have a straightforward solution.
Just to add on to that quickly, as Americans in France, we're living in a different country this year. I think it's just even more important to, really be exposed and really try to read the news and follow the news because so much is happening all around the world. So not just in the US, but seriously, like so many different issues are like occurring, and it's so important to just stay well informed, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, Helen, I was going to get to you anyway because I was going to ask you if this is a catch-22 that we can't get out of, that people aren't involved in their government because they're not getting their information, and they're not getting their information because they think they can't do anything to affect what's happening.
Yes, sure it is. And we've been talking about distrust and disillusionment, but in free societies. But let's just for a moment think about what the alternative is when you're living in a society where voices are completely stifled. A society like Russia, you know, where Alexei Navalny died last year in an Arctic prison, where people are absolutely terrified, and where what happens is that people say one thing in public, they say one thing when they go to school or they go to work, and they say something completely different in the privacy of their own homes around the kitchen table, whispering. They will say at home what they don't dare to say outside. And so you end up with an entire society which is living a gigantic lie. And so whatever problems, you know, we have in the West with disillusionment and paywalls, we nevertheless, we don't have this situation in America or in the UK or in France or even in Eastern Europe like Hungary and Romania, where people are so scared that they say one thing outside and another thing inside. I think that's really important to bear in mind.
Another question from the audience for the students. Now, I'm assuming that you have some strong opinions on things, and we're not going to ask you what your strong opinions are, but the question from the audience is, do you seek out opinions and information sources that are contrary to what you think? Breck?
Yeah, yes, it's sometimes, as of late, I'd say in the past, really in the past year and a half with the election, sometimes I like to turn on Fox News or some other news channel that I don't necessarily agree with. And it's kind of honestly a comedy show sometimes because there's such a big gap in the content that is shared and the perspectives that are shared that it's mind-blowing to me to see the differences in the news that's published and the reasoning that's given by talking heads. And so, yes, but I think it's very hard to put yourself in a neutral position into where you can watch both news sources and mix the opinions to have a center viewpoint. Because I think there's just the bias, the preconceived bias in the back of our heads where we've consumed, you know, whether it be like primarily left sources your whole life or right sources your whole life is very, very strong and very hard to sort of lock away and to stay neutral. So yes, but I don't know to how degree it is effective.
What about you, Sophie?
For me, to be honest, in the past couple of months I've been living in France, it's been still an effort for me to, you know, really search out the news because, of course, I have my host parents here who watch French news like pretty often. But, you know, I really don't get that opposition side as much as I think I would have in the US, especially with my family back home, because I think my dad, for example, he would sometimes watch Fox News and I would get that, you know, contrasting opinion or different opinion. But I think I'm lacking in that. And I think that's something that I should definitely work on. And I think, as Breck said, it's very important to just really stay balanced and to try to see the other side. But it, of course, takes effort and it's not very easy. So I think that's something that I should aspire to try to see the different opinion and the different view. But yeah.
What about you, Arya?
So as well, I don't actively seek out news outlets that give out opposing views. But if I do come across it, I enjoy reading it. Like it's fun to know other people's perspectives and how they view things because it can be drastically different to how you view things. And I think it can help you grow as a person as well. Like learning about other people and how they and what kind of um, views they have on things and their opinions as well.
Yeah, I always say, what's the point in reading something you already agree with? It's much more fun to read something you disagree with and yell at it. Alexandru, is this a problem that in general that people kind of are avoiding information sources that they think that they're going to disagree with?
Yes, it definitely is. But unfortunately, in this flood of information that is present these days, it becomes also a matter of time. Oftentimes people say, oh, I don't have time to read that many articles, that many newspapers, conflicting newspapers, for example. So yeah, it is an issue, but again, it transforms itself into an issue related to time most of the time. Sorry for the repetition. Yeah, and I want to connect a bit to something that Breck said a while ago. I didn't intervene then. I had numerous projects with my association in the last 8 years, and we've traveled the country far and wide. And unfortunately, I can confirm that the distrust is real, distrust of the young people, at least in Romania. They told us numerous times when we asked them what are their sources of information, they either responded with classic stuff like, let's say, BBC. They thought we were expecting to hear that answer, or they didn't give actually a proper answer, which showed that they don't follow traditional media. So the distrust is real. We felt it, and our last elections, of which I'm sure you know a thing or two, showed, among other things, this distrust. There was on the side of young people, there was I don't know, a distrust vote. Let's call it like that. They voted in anger, and that, among other things, was a sign of their distrust and their distancing from traditional media.
Okay. You know, one of the places historically where we've had sources around the globe of neutral information, right? Not on one side or the other, have been the news wires. And Helen came out of a news wire, and we have a question from the audience asking about this in terms of the students. Do you ever turn to news wires? Are you even aware that they exist? And do you know what they are?
Just to answer quickly, I don't know what that means.
Okay,
So,
okay,
to be honest, so yeah.
okay,
Isn't
good. That's what we want to know.
the only thing that I've heard of, and I could be wildly off base, is like a fee that corporations pay to get their articles like published like further up on the page,
Okay.
or it's like maybe I'm totally off there, but
Okay. And Arya?
Like I said, I'm not familiar with the term, and I'm just shooting an arrow in the dark here. But is it where a news company distributes stories to its viewers or subscribers, or like to other companies?
Yeah, it's see, this is what the person from the audience wanted to know. It's no, a news wire is an organization that has reporters all over the world that reports on news for news organizations all over the world. So traditionally, there's been the Associated Press, and in France is Agence France Presse, and Reuters, which Helen came out of, and there's might be a few others out there. But yeah, there seems to be this disconnect now between young people, because news wires used to be a quite a big place to get news, to get neutral news. So we've seen this difference.
yeah, oh, sorry.
No, go on, Brett.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sure, like, of course, we've all heard of, the AP, Reuters. I've never heard the term newswire before. I think it's more of just like a term thing. Maybe
Oh, okay.
it's
Maybe
just
it's one of those journalism things that we think
yeah.
everyone knows and no one knows. Right, right. Yeah, sometimes, it's funny as journalists, we're like, oh no, do jargon, and then we throw out all kinds of jargon. Yes, Helen.
Well, and could I just clarify as well that young people in the past would not have got their news directly from news wires. They would have got their news from wire stories which were published in newspapers, because it's the newspapers that subscribe to the wires. It would have been rather unlikely that private individuals would have subscribed directly to the wires.
Yeah, it's funny though. Everyone knew they existed though. They were yes, Sophie.
Just to follow up, so are news wires kind of like people, so you said people in different countries like kind of feeding I guess like information and like concrete evidence, like, you know, witnesses, things like that to the news companies, like the real information basically?
Well, basically they're so if you had your own publication, sophienews.com, and you're a two-man operation, you can't send people to Russia.
Yeah.
You can't send people to Bangladesh.
You're getting the information from
So there's an organization called Reuters or the Associated Press or Agence France Presse, and they do that. They have reporters all over the world. And you, as your legal news organization, you tap into that. But it's the source of the idea being that because this wire service is giving you the news, and Breck.com, which has an opposing viewpoint, the same story. The story cannot be biased, because otherwise they won't get both of you to do it. Good. Well, that was informative. So we have about 10 more minutes. So I do want to connect back to this idea of democracy and journalism. So what we've heard so far is that there's some distrust among the news media, and there's this idea that in order to have democracy, you need to have an informed public. That was actually the basis of the First Amendment in the United States. The founding fathers of the United States said, you know what, we cannot have a democracy without an informed public. But what we are seeing, at least in the United States, is that we don't quite have an informed public. We have lots of news organizations, but the public does not actually seem to be that informed. And so is there now a disconnect that can't be bridged between this idea of informing people? We've got lots of information out there. I mean, there's endless amounts of information out there. But you see these surveys that seem to imply that even though people are consuming information, they're not necessarily informed. And so how do we create an informed public? Alexandru, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I guess. I think it all boils down to the education system, which in Romania, I'm sorry to say, it's not that great. A well-educated well-educated public with strong basis of critical thinking can at least try to make sense of all this information. Yes, it is too much. Yes, it is confusing. If I'm not mistaken, maybe Helen can help me here. One of the key points of Russian propaganda is not to convince you that you are wrong, just to create confusion, to make you so confused that you want to give up. So I don't know if we can do some housekeeping in the press. It's too complicated in my opinion, but we can have better readers. My problem is not with journalists, it's with the readers. We need better readers first, not better journalists. Those readers will ask more in time from journalists. So I think that's one way of tackling it.
What do you think, Helen?
Well, I think we journalists have to go back to basics, and we have to stick to the principles of our profession. And our job is to provide not just a sea of information, but quality information. And that's what we're trained to do out of a sea of information. We're trained to pick what's actually meaningful. Alexander was speaking earlier about the problem of time. Poor readers now are so overwhelmed having to find things out for themselves, and they don't have time. You know, if you're a nurse in a hospital or a bus driver, you don't have time to go through the different sources. That is actually the journalist's job. We do that for you on behalf of the reader. And so I think that there is nothing wrong with the original principles and ethics of journalism. I think we must stick to them and go back to them where we may have gone astray from them. But I believe that journalism is a noble profession. It's a public service. It's our job to provide information so that citizens can make informed decisions about their own lives. The opposite, the extreme opposite, when you have no information at all, is, I don't know, North Korean soldiers in Ukraine writing in their diaries, we love Kim, we love Kim, we love Kim. Or to give you another extreme example of the total absence of information, it's Syrian prisoners under Assad who could only work out what was happening in jail from listening to the sounds of their fellows being executed. So, you know, that's one extreme, the total utter absence of information. Then you have a kind of middle situation, like with this new Chinese DeepSeek AI thing that's appeared today. It will seek information for you, but not if you want to find out about Tiananmen Square or Taiwan. So I believe that readers, the public, are entitled as a human right to have full, factual, accurate, clean, fair, balanced information. And it is our job as journalists, as public servants, to provide it. And sometimes we even do it to the risk of our lives, but that is our vocation.
Aria, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you feel that you are generally informed about what's going on in the world?
Yes, I'd like to believe so.
And what makes you think that?
Well, initially, I used to be part of the population that not read the newspaper. It seemed tiresome to me, but my parents kept on pushing me because they believed it was something essential for me. And when I started reading the newspaper, I actually found it very interesting to learn about different events because as an average reader myself, it felt like a storybook to me, learning about different views, different things that are happening around the world. So I believe, yes, I'd like to think of myself as well informed.
Now, Sophie, you said that you're from Washington, D.C., and I lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years. It's a very strange place. So, and you said that you read The Guardian and some other sources. So I'm assuming you're pretty well informed about the rest of the world. Do you feel like you're very informed about your own country? Would you know very much about what's happening, say, in Colorado or Utah?
You know, that's actually a very good question for me, especially because I have a bit of a mixed background. So both of my parents are Albanian originally, and I have family in Italy. So basically, I have lots of family around the world, and this basically makes me more interested in, really seeking out information and, having these cultural connections and differences. And I think I'm very well informed on things that happen outside of the US, but I kind of actually lack I think I lack a well understanding of things that happen really in the US. Not to say that I don't, focus on issues in the US, because I do, but I think I have this kind of international interest, and I think I maybe should focus more on the US in the future. So yeah, I don't know.
So Breck, my question then to you is, can you know what you don't know? I mean, we assume that we're informed, right? Because we read what we read and we hear what we hear. But when we talk about this new AI tool that is giving you lots of information on something, but not information on other things, we don't really know what we're missing out on, do we?
I think to a degree, it's dependent on personal agency and if we're going out and actually seeking the information. But if we believe ourselves to be informed about a subject, I don't believe that we're going to find ourselves actively searching to learn more about it. And so I think by not continuing to search, you can make yourself uninformed. So if that's the question, I think then yes, we can like not know what we don't know because we're not actively searching for it. But I feel like I'm running in circles with the question here.
Okay. Well, then the question, the question we're going to wrap up with, because we've got 5 more minutes, is: are you at all worried about censorship of information? And you started, Breck, one of your first comments was pointing out that in the United States, most of the news agencies are profit oriented. And we do know that many news media now are leaning in different political ways. So do you think that censorship is becoming a problem?
I would say that I am far more concerned with censorship regarding state-run media than I am with private organizations controlling media. And that's because with private organizations, they have their own interests at heart, but then the network, like the world of the media we consume, is built up by multiple media sources that are each going to be expressing different viewpoints in different articles. Where if you have a centralized news system that's run by the government or state-owned, the only interests that are going to be broadcasted are the interests of the state. And I think that's where censorship and sort of the downfall of democracy really, not to sound cliche, but really becomes a question of, or really becomes a problem. Because democracy is built, like the cornerstone of democracy is productive disagreement. And you cannot have productive disagreement if you don't have multiple viewpoints, because you need people to disagree with each other. And so I think censorship and tunnel vision on one viewpoint really only becomes a problem when you have state-run media. And I'm not as concerned when you have a multitude of different privately owned and run media sources.
What about you, Sophie? Does censorship concern you?
I mean, on the one hand, yes, like of course, when we see international, like different countries, for example, there was mentioned Russia before, Putin, and how, for example, Russians have no idea what's going on in Ukraine and the war there. And for example, the death of Alexei Navalny, those both really shocked me, and they continue to shock me because I think it should put us on edge, and really, like, point us as observers and as just citizens of the world to really understand what's happening abroad and to see that and become concerned. So yes, I am, but I don't think that would happen in the US because many reasons. But so yes and no. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Okay. But what about you, Arya?
Well, I believe that journalism is like the heartbeat of democracy, and it helps, it empowers citizens toward informed decisions. But I would like to say, like, it might be a little controversial, but I believe censorship in some regard is important in aspects of national security that might negatively affect the nation. I believe there, but otherwise, I believe the public should be informed about what goes on in their country, and so they can function properly.
Okay. Alexandru, do you think that we should be concerned about censorship of news media, either by the owners of the news media or government?
Definitely. I was too young to experience what real censorship means under communism, but that memory that I don't have, actually, it's not that far. And given the recent developments on the world stage, and given the recent developments in Romania, I'm quite afraid we could experience that again. We had state-imposed censorship. It might seem outlandish, but I don't think we are in this moment that far from a bit different forms of censorship, but censorship nevertheless. Again, as long as Breck said, we have different media outlets with different viewpoints and sources of funding that are competing for our attention, that's fine. That's also a form of censorship. They are structuring the information in a certain way. But we can still work with that. But with state-imposed censorship, not really. And yeah, I'm afraid we could experience it again in a form of one way or another.
Okay, we need to wrap up now, but Helen, I'm gonna let you have the last word.
Well, yes, of course, I'm concerned about censorship, but I'm also concerned about self-censorship. This is what happens, you know, when we feel that we can't say something. And so I would give the last word to Alexei Navalny before he died. Don't be afraid, speak your truth.
Great. Well, thank you very much for all of your participation. This has been a really insightful conversation. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to the audience for all those amazing questions. And sorry if we haven't been able to get to them. And please join us on our next Decoder Dialogue. We do this once a month, and you can send us suggestions for future Decoder Dialogues at info@newsdecoder.com. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.